When we think of the Great Depression years, do you imagine throngs of starving children and hollow-eyed women? Me too. But beyond the tangible, the Great Depression spelled out a major change for the American food structure. Spend an hour with us to see how our ancestors crafted meals in innovative ways during tough periods. Let's kick things off with a classic Depression-era stew. Now, this wasn't your fancy beef stew. It was more like a throw-everything-in-the-pot kind of deal. We're talking potatoes, carrots, onions, and maybe some barley if you were lucky. And the meat? Well, if you had any, great. If not, no worries. It's also known as mulligan stew or hobo stew and was originally created by American hobos in camps in the early 1900s. During the Great Depression, homeless men would sleep in a hobo jungle. Traditionally, the jungle would have a large campfire and a pot into which each person would put a portion of their food to create a shared dish that was, hopefully, more tasteful and varied than his original portion. It made you feel like you were getting a real meal, even if it was mostly broth. Yeah, the next time you need to clean out your fridge, channel your inner 1930s chef and whip up some Depression-era stew. You might just find a new favorite comfort food. Next up is the infamous garbage plate. Before you start raising eyebrows because of the name of this one, just hear me out. So this was basically a mishmash of whatever was on hand. Imagine a plate filled to the brim with macaroni salad, home fries, baked beans, and some kind of protein like sausage or ground beef. And don't forget the toppings: chili, onions, mustard, and your choice of hot sauce or ketchup. Sounds appetizing, right? The garbage plate originated in 1918, the garbage plate, and became the signature dish of Rochester. If you missed out on it, don't fret because it's still served by numerous restaurants under names such as Rochester Plate, Trash Plate, or Simply Plate. This meal was a classic when wallets were tight back in the day and there weren't many gourmet options on hand. Plus, it had all the carbs and fats you needed to keep going through tough times, and the kids loved it. What's not to love about fries and macaroni? This dish is a classic example of don't judge a book by its cover, or in this case, by its name. Okay, this one is a bit of a curveball: cold milk soup. But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Cold milk soup was a Depression-era staple, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This dish has Amish origins and was one of the most popular meals back in the day. It was also pretty simple to whip up. Take some milk, mix in sliced bananas, a bit of sugar, and sometimes even bread or other fruits. And there you have it, cold milk soup. It might not sound like much, but for many families, this was a quick and easy way to get some calories and nutrients, especially when fresh ingredients were hard to come by. The bananas added some natural sweetness, while the milk provided protein and fat. It was a simple, no-cook meal that could be thrown together in minutes and was perfect for those hot summer days when turning on the stove was the last thing you wanted to do. Potato pancakes, an incredibly famous go-to recipe for grandmas across the nation today. Do you know how and why they ended up nailing the recipe for a fine potato pancake so perfectly, though? Potatoes were one of the most easily available vegetables, both when buying with cash or bartering, plus lots of people started growing their own produce. Potatoes were a crop they went for regularly, because the flour and butter needed for a real pancake was not an option for many people. So, potato pancakes became the common breakfast of the century for a good decade or two, and it honestly held its ground pretty well. Made out of grated potatoes and simple seasonings, this felt just as good as a legitimate pancake. Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. Depression cake and war cake are just a few of the titles this cake has. It proved that even if things were economically bad, people still had a sweet tooth. It was not just a silly craving, but a sign of comfort and a reminder of more normal days. After all, actual cake was way out of the question when people had to live off of $5 a week and feed their entire families along with it. Depression cake, as glum as it sounds, was a very welcome addition to most people's baking roster since it substituted milk with water, baking powder with eggs, and shortening instead of butter. This significantly reduced the cost of making a cake, and it was one of the things that started mock cuisine in America. Speaking of cakes, hot water cornbread was also a not-so-close but close enough alternative to your regular layered delights. It was made in a pan, and the batter was shaped into cakes before being fried in hot fat to add that iconic crisp that nothing else had. Seriously, this thing gave fried chicken burgers a run for their money in retrospect. Then some salt and boiling water was all you needed. It had a perfectly crisp exterior that crumbled in your mouth perfectly, while the inside was tender, warm, and very reminiscent of Grandma's cooking. Probably why it caught on as much as it did, since most of these ingredients managed to get the long end of the stick with inflation. Waldorf salad had humble beginnings and was commonly found in the Waldorf Astoria cookbooks, and as you may have figured, gets its name from there as well. However, by the time of the 20s, this had become a go-to lunch for almost every state in America. Its popularity could not be overstated, and this was because the dish could be very versatile. You could serve it at tables for presidents or as a healthy family meal. It usually consisted of celery salad and mayo, with nuts and fruits like grapes. Besides the parties of the top elite, this was very common for neighborhood get-togethers, as well as every part of America had their own spin on the dish. The supermarket culture of America was actually a result of the growth spurt in America's finances during the Roaring '20s. A lot of marts popped up, and they became a much more common sight, and as a result, so did icebox cakes. These cakes were first shown to the public in World War I as a quick and easy way to whip up a cake minus all the tedious baking. Everybody loves cracking open the oven every now and then, but sometimes you just want your sweet tooth catered to without all the grunt work. Icebox cakes were the way to go for situations like that. All you needed were crackers and some whipping cream. Many marts sold ready-to-serve packaged versions too, so you can imagine how this got around as much as it did. Baked Alaskas were some really tough competition for packaged products like icebox cakes, since the taste factor often gave people enough of an incentive to get up and start baking. This dessert consists of a cake with ice cream covered with meringue, baked for a while at the end to give the meringue a firm, golden exterior. The ice cream doesn't melt because the meringue helps protect it from the heat. Pretty genius dish, right? We love it when people use science in their cooking to make up nifty creations we could not imagine on our own. Now, why it is called the Baked Alaska is a bit of a hot debate. There is some weight to the idea that it was named like this when it first started being popularized in 1867 to celebrate the U.S. acquiring Alaska. While historians will always argue over this, one thing that is not up for discussion is how good dessert was. Trust us, Alaskans were not the only ones enjoying the sheer bliss of a good baked Alaska. Hoover stew was one of those dishes that anyone could afford to make, so it is no wonder that the stew was a common item in the Great Depression. Hoover stew had two signature traits. It could feed the whole family, and you could have the dish without exceeding the monthly budget. As for the recipe, the dish involved using scraps and leftovers to increase savings and recycling in a time when households could not afford a lot. You did not need many spices, and you could easily use leftover meats. In an America where banks were going bankrupt and the job market was hopeless, the stew was a welcome addition. Obviously, it would be a popular choice among many households, as our older viewers might still remember. Fortunately, as economic stability came back, Hoover stew went away from tables in favor of more flavorful and varied stews. Mock apple pie is another delicious dessert that clicked with masses across the nations during rough times. As apples were getting expensive, people were looking for cheaper alternatives. That is when the mock apple pie entered. Resemblance is one thing, but if the pie looks and tastes like it, then it might as well be an apple pie. Created using cheap and the nation favorite Ritz crackers, mixing those with some vanilla syrup, sprinkle some lemon and cinnamon to create a perfect home-baked pie fit to rival apple pie. The Depression era onwards really saw an explosion in its popularity. We cannot really blame people either. Fresh, juicy apples were in hot demand and short supply. The pie was just as cheap as Hoover stew and easy to make. Nowadays, of course, you would not find this in houses you go to, despite it being popular enough that Ritz had instructions on the back of the box on how to make it. Nobody could ever hate on a potato croquette, and a lot of people have paid their due respect to the game of these legendary appetizers, and that goes doubly true for the 1920s. Potato croquettes with a side of wings were an incredibly popular combo at many bars and diners, and they were also the go-to snack of many teenagers before or after school. Maybe you cannot imagine spending your Wednesday in either of those contexts. Okay, so let's say you have a party or want to throw one. One of the best munching options were potato croquettes because they made for great conversation food. That is a term we came up with to refer to food that really helps the flow of a conversation go by smoother. And there was nothing like talking the evening away with a good friend over a fresh batch of some croquettes. Similarly, tea sandwiches held their own rank in terms of what the best option for entertaining your guests is. Along with finger sandwiches and some croquettes or salad, you had yourself a pretty respectable follow-up to asking them to stay for a bite or two. Tea sandwiches were relatively easy and stress-free and also came in many different forms, like pineapple tea sandwiches or parsley bacon tea sandwiches and even shrimp tea sandwiches. All taste buds were very much catered to, so it is no surprise that they got so well known in the country. Plus, everyone loves to chat over some classy-looking food, and what better way to set the tone than with a high tea or brunch type of vibe? Introducing Duchess potatoes, which were potato hash browns, meets mashed potatoes meets potato cutlets in a way that redefined comfort food. Just as appetizing and mouth-watering as they look, these golden Duchess potatoes were purees of mashed potato made with egg yolk and butter. People would sprinkle all kinds of spices onto them, but you could also enjoy it if you kept the seasoning rather light. Sticking to just salt and pepper, for example, was not unheard of. You would ideally bake these until they get that golden sunshiny glow, and that is when you know they are done. This recipe really went wild in the South, where almost everybody had gotten in on the Duchess potato craze. Let's talk a little about snacking, shall we? So one very popular munch-heavy snack was biscuits that went along with this gravy made out of sausage drippings, and it actually enhanced the flavor more than you would think. Americans already ate a lot of biscuits before the Depression took place, but afterwards, they became a godsend. We are serious. Finding an extra biscuit was an entirely different experience in that era. Popular brands like the 1930s vintage car or the bourbon biscuit, Huntley and Palmer's, all kinds of biscuits that people could get their hands on were in hot demand, since you would never know if dinner or breakfast was guaranteed. Best to bide your time with some biscuits in that case. If they come with a killer dip, then that silver lining shines just a bit brighter. Pancakes and cutlets were not the only comfort cooking people made out of the vegetable we just talked about because it is oh so resourceful. Potato soup was also a regular item at the top of the menu. People would usually use whatever basic vegetables they had to make the soup more varied, but even potatoes, some grounded black pepper and water went fine. Typically, though, people would barter for a few onions or carrots to spice the soup up for special occasions or when it had been a while since they had their last good bowl of hot soup, especially in the winters when people needed nutrition more than ever. In about 25 minutes, you had yourself a quality and healthy meal that kept your energy going for all the labor of the week. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. Prune pudding. Sounds delicious, right? Nothing unusual about this one. It was a classic hit. Prunes were a popular choice during the Depression because they were cheap, stored well, and were, well, let's just say, effective. Many prominent figures during the 1930s ate frugally, just as most Americans did during the Great Depression. To promote the support of frugal and thrifty eating, Eleanor Roosevelt served prune pudding at formal White House functions, and that's how prunes became all the rage. The fruit was cooked until soft, mashed up, mixed with water and sugar, and a bit of flour or cornstarch to thicken it up. This dessert might not win any beauty contests, but it was a sweet treat that many families enjoyed. Prunes are not the most, luxurious of items out there. I'm sure you pass by prunes in the grocery store without even glancing at them, but they were a lifesaver for our taste buds back in the day. You know what that calls for? A place for them in your cart next time you go grocery shopping. Okay, this next one sounds like some kind of alien food, but milcorno was a Depression-era kitchen miracle. It was a government-invented mixture of cornmeal and dried milk powder, designed to be a cheap and nutritious substitute for more expensive foods. A research team led by Flora Rose developed milcorno, milkoato, and milkweedo cereals in the early 1930s, and they were sold exclusively to the Federal Emergency Relief Administration for distribution to Americans impoverished by the Depression. It was claimed that by substituting milcorno for flour and cornmeal, a family of 5 could eat for less than $5 a week. The best part about milcorno was its versatility. You could use it as a base for porridge, bake it into cornbread, or even use it to thicken soups. And while it might not sound super exciting, milcorno dishes could actually be pretty tasty with the right seasonings and a bit of creativity. With the rise of delicious cereals, there's no room for it in our diets now, but hey, no one's going to judge you if you want to give it a try. Here's a sandwich combo that might make you do a double take: peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Yes, you heard that right. Before PB&J sandwiches became a thing, peanut butter and mayo sandwiches was all the rage. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this one tastes far better than it sounds. In the 1930s, peanut butter and mayonnaise were both affordable and readily available, making them a popular pairing. The creamy, salty peanut butter mixed with the tangy mayo created a unique flavor combination that some people swear by to this day. It might sound strange, but remember, during the Great Depression, you ate what you could afford, and this sandwich was cheap and filling. So, if you're feeling brave and want to try something new, make yourself a peanut butter and mayo sandwich. Who knows, you might discover a new guilty pleasure. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. After going through several decades of rough dieting that was pretty meatless and vegetable salads that just left you thinking some crackers were better for dinner, Americans very much enjoyed the return of proper eating with things like ginger ale salad. Salads had already been rising as their own separate area in America's cuisine, which might be hard to believe if you look at the fast food-ridden landscape of today, but 100 years is a lot of time for a nation to change. Ginger ale salad would make it into the Christmas and Thanksgiving traditions of many families. A pint of ginger ale, some pineapple, Canton ginger, and Malaga grapes, you were set for the rest of the night. This one dish could provide every tropical flavor note a person could crave, which is part of why it had so much success as a holiday meal. Peach melbas were a lot like that too, but they reminded people more of a breezy day during the fall, and it is hard to associate it with anything else. Maybe it is because of the peach flavor or the orange hue of the dish, but it really does invite you to take your time with it. Filled with raspberry sauce and peaches upon a hefty serving of vanilla ice cream, Auguste Escoffier first brought this magnificent bit of heaven to American tables in 1892, but it picked up a lot of steam during the Roaring '20s. People could actually afford a lot of the ingredients to make this at home again, and they definitely could on a night out in the town. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. In Texas as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on. Especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. All right, let's talk about a real comfort food of the Depression: bean in tomato stew. Beans were a go-to ingredient during the Depression days because of how nutritious, affordable, and versatile they are. It's basically just what it sounds like: beans cooked in a tomato-based broth. But you could also throw in potatoes, carrots, and maybe even a little bit of rice for extra substance. The beans provided a good source of protein and fiber, while the tomato sauce added a burst of flavor. This stew could be enjoyed on its own or served over rice, bread, or even mashed potatoes if you were lucky enough to have them. Originally, Native Americans sweetened baked beans with maple syrup, but then someone decided to turn this protein into a stew, and hey, we're not complaining. It was a filling meal back in the day, and it's still cooked in many households around America where the budget is a bit too tight. I know this dish might sound plain, but believe me, when your belly is rumbling and your pantry is bare, this stew can be a lifesaver. Next up, a dish that sounds almost too simple to be true: tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. I know, it doesn't exactly scream gourmet, but remember, we're talking about a time when people were just trying to survive. This combo was a way to stretch those precious few ingredients. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a cheap and filling staple, and tomato sauce was an easy way to add flavor. This dish was essentially a plate of creamy mashed potatoes topped with a savory tomato sauce. It might sound a bit unusual, but this combination was a hit because it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. Plus, potatoes were versatile. You could mash them, fry them, or bake them depending on what you had. So, if you're ever in the mood for a simple yet tasty meal, try tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. Let's see if this humble dish can impress our modern taste buds. Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. Up next, we have a dish that was all about making the most out of simple ingredients: spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole. It can be argued that Eleanor Roosevelt did the best she could during the Great Depression. The First Lady promoted dishes to encourage savvy homemakers, such as a casserole made from spaghetti, boiled carrots, and a simple white sauce of milk, flour, salt, and butter. The spaghetti had to be cooked for 25 minutes. The idea was to get the noodles mushy so they paired nicely with the boiled carrots and a penny's worth of creamy sauce. The result? A vehicle for nutrition and nutrients. Families loved this dish because it was versatile and could easily be modified based on what was available. It was a great way to fill up hungry bellies without breaking the bank. It still makes a pretty delicious meal for potlucks, so if you want to impress everyone with something easy to whip up, the spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole will do. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Cabbage and noodles typically just looked like a pound of cabbage and a medium serving of noodles. More or less, it was not the most expensive dish, and you could enjoy a bowl by making it pretty quickly. Away from the pancake and pie-addled fanatics or admirers of noodles across the states, everyone needs their cravings satisfied from time to time, even if the soaring prices spared no one. In some areas, cabbage and noodles was known as haluski. However, in most places, it was simply referred to as cabbage and noodles, the most typical Depression-era noodle recipe. It's a must-have that needed to be in your repertoire if you were to survive the times and not forget every taste you ever loved. Someone really needs to study how times like these bring out everyone's culinary creativity. Mulligatawny soup became pretty popular in South Asian communities across the United States, and it was one of the first really well-known curry-based dishes that became sort of mainstream back then. The name is actually quite simple despite sounding complex. It just means pepper water. And we know you might already be thinking about the spice levels since it does involve curry, but do not worry. This was actually a bit more on the mild side and most people could handle it, but just in case you really doubt your tolerance, maybe keep some milk nearby for good measure. It would take about an hour and a half to make, but you could feed the entire family with just some onions and basic vegetables, some chicken and curry powder mixed into one really homely soup. Chestnut puree was a much faster dish in comparison, only taking about 20 minutes to cook and 5 or 10 minutes to prepare. If even that seemed like too much effort, you could easily opt for store-bought versions in the 1920s. When dishes get real love in America, there are always handy variants of them at the store you can pick up for a convenient price. It would feed around 4 to 5 people, so maybe making it at home was not such a bad idea. People loved it for its nutty and earthy taste and how it used cooked chestnuts and vanilla beans to give a soft but very dense flavor. Combining the best of both sweet and savory, this was a middle ground for many Americans on opposite sides of food wars. In World War I, cow tongues became really popular because they were cheap and packed more than enough protein for your daily or weekly needs. Beef tongues were not exactly very familiar with Americans at that point in history, though, so to make them a little easier to go down the hatch, beef tongues with raisin sauce started seeing a lot of traction across states. They didn't require much either. Perhaps the hardest ingredient to find was half a cup of currant jelly. The rest of it, any home chef would probably find sitting in their pantry already. The meat would be drained, the bones cut, and then the skin was peeled. This would be served soaked in raisin sauce, and it was definitely an acquired taste. If you are wondering right now how cow tongues were popularized, do not forget that this was a time plagued with economic issues. People had to make do with what they had, and cow tongues fulfilled people's weekly protein intake like no other affordable meat in the market. And to be fair, cow tongues, when cooked well, were not all too bad. Egg custard pie is similarly just as easy to make since the whole thing relies on 5 simple ingredients, with the custard filling taking center stage this time. The trick to a fabulous egg custard pie is to make an incredibly smooth filling, almost like silk, and beating those eggs until they are the proper consistency helps. Nutmeg gives the filling thickness, while the crispy crust is the perfect packaging for this dessert to come in. This is why you would find it at nearly every family gathering, especially in the South and in states like Massachusetts and Georgia. Making the crust on your own was not a requirement since the dish already takes a while to make, around roughly 2 hours, and so using a store-bought crust is helpful. However, for the most authentic taste, you should go all in and make everything from scratch. A dish that can only be described as an edible fluffy cloud basking in the sunset, this baked meringue set in a puddle of crème anglaise, laced with caramel sets off all the alarms in anyone's heart, mind, and soul. A frothy egg dessert that won competitions and the favor of in-laws across America, this was one of the most iconic winter-themed desserts to go for. This was originally a French dessert and appeared in famous cookbooks from the 19th century, like the Book of Household Management. As a result, you would often see it in French-American restaurants, and if you knew a home chef capable enough to take the dish on, you were a lucky person indeed. Despite the prices of white sugar dropping as a whole after the First World War, leading molasses to decline in popularity, they made a strong comeback as the engine fueled a great batch of molasses cookies. People also started abandoning white sugar during the Second World War, and it caused them to look for alternatives for their yearly Christmas baking sessions, and the government was already pushing on molasses for widespread public use pretty hard. Eventually, people saw the value, and the ones that did not have to because it was so much cheaper to get molasses than any other ingredient. That, along with some sorghum syrup, meant that people could still enjoy a fresh batch of hot cookies and warm milk to welcome the winter. It might not seem like much, but maintaining tiny traditions like that meant a lot to people and kept their spirits going as the days got harder and costlier. Speaking of molasses, they also went really great with some slow-baked beans. Molasses have a knack for adding a lot of deep flavor to a dish, and the fact that these were usually left overnight to absorb all of it made for probably the best baked beans people could get in those times. It was especially popular as a summertime meal. Baked beans were not too hard to get, not the tinned versions because those were still pricey. Once you had some, you would just leave them in water to soften, and then the beans would be baked for 8 hours straight overnight. Making it was a whole day, literally. But once you were done with the prep work, it was all just a waiting game, and this was one time where being patient really paid off. We have had a pretty concerning lack of pies on the list so far, right? Let's fix that by going down memory lane where we can find potato and onion pies, a delicacy that took America by storm, especially in the Midwest. Dried potatoes, sliced onions sprinkled with salt, pepper, and garlic, and you had a pretty killer pie. If by some luck the average household back then had some cheese to spare as well, then some serious fine dining would take place. Parmesan cheese was something Grandma incorporated much later when it became readily available again, but the authentic gritty potato and onion pie of the early 30s was an experience in and of itself. Some dishes just exude an air of comfort and homeliness, like being back in your childhood neighborhood at 7 a.m. on a really sunny day. This was definitely one of those. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out, and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. The Great Depression might not have the most appetizing recipes, but the era did give the world the Kraft macaroni and cheese dinner. In 1937, Kraft heard about a salesman for the Tenderoni Macaroni Company of St. Louis going rogue and selling his noodles with packets of Kraft grated cheese attached. They hired the man to promote the concept and started selling it to cash-strapped Americans at the low price of 19 cents for 4 servings. Some variations of this comfort food even included cooked vegetables or even a can of tuna. It was a great way to feed the family without spending a lot of money, and it quickly became a favorite for kids and adults alike. Even today, it remains a beloved comfort food. Liver loaf might not sound appetizing, but it was a popular way to use up inexpensive liver during the Depression. It is a dish that might not be for everyone, but was an important source of nutrition during the tough days. The liver was one of the more affordable cuts of meat, and it was packed with essential nutrients. It's basically a meatloaf made with liver, mixed with breadcrumbs, onions, and spices. We'll add some carrots and celery for extra flavor and texture. It was often eaten as a main course, providing much-needed protein and iron. Food historians say that loaves were very popular during the Great Depression because they were made from an ingredient and a cheap thing that stretches the ingredient out. Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. Milk toast is exactly what the name suggests. Toasted to perfection bread dipped in milk with a generous slap of butter. On days when any meal you loved was unaffordable and getting up to cook something proper was dreadful, milk toast came through for many families. All you needed was some good fresh bread and a warm glass of milk to gorge on until you felt full. Milk toast quickly became one of the most popular breakfasts in the States, catering specifically to people below the poverty line who could not make most of the items on this list regularly. Nowadays, this might be considered a very vintage meal, the type to get kids asking you what century you might be from. But back then, it was something even working-class 20-year-olds would eat daily. Times have changed, and the breakfast of people in those socioeconomic classes is definitely different. Mary Jane candy wasn't as flashy as a floating island, but it definitely took care of everyone's sweet tooth cravings in just the same way. A dearly beloved invention of Robert O. Lord, the man named it Mary Jane in memory of his favorite aunt. While Robert eventually sold his company and the recipe for this delicious candy was tweaked and altered over the decades, nobody can forget or surpass the excitement when it first came out in the USA in 1914. There is a reason companies like Stark Candy, Atkinson Candy, Spangler Candy, and Necco's kept vying for who would get to inherit the recipe next. This thing sold boatloads and made a pretty substantial heap of money to whichever company it would migrate to eventually. Needless to say, you shouldn't try to outdo the original, because although Mary Jane's sold well regardless of who held the rights, they never quite matched the quality they had when Robert O. Lord was making them. Hook-caught haddock fresh off the line from the most reliable fisheries in the nation, Finnan Haddies were the king of the smoked seafood scene, and despite being a hot choice in the 20s, this time-tested dish has survived and put up more than a fair fight in every era. Special occasions, comfort meals, or a fancy romantic dinner, Finnan Haddies were there to make any occasion significantly more exciting and a lot more flavorful. It was a pretty versatile dish, but it packed a lot of nutrition too, and it was always made from really thick fillets of fish, so you would be going with a full stomach when you were done eating. Also, Finnan Haddies were one of those dishes that worked as breakfast, lunch, and dinner, so no matter what the time was, if you were having a seafood craving, you could whip this up and take care of that real quick. Pheasant under glass sounds extremely fancy, almost like a dish with some deep philosophical meaning or historical context attached to it, but it is just a poultry dish with dramatic presentation. Not to say that does not add to the appeal, since presentation is a pretty big part of the overall experience. Pheasant under glass was typically made with pheasant breasts that were braised in a wine reduction and served with shallots. This was also known as rich people's food in the early 18th and 19th century, and it was a sign of wealth. Eating dishes like this helped people feel more fancy about themselves, like they were more cultured, because they were having pheasant breast served in a glass dome. We cannot blame that thinking, because if our dinner came in a literal dome, we would feel more dignified about it too. Derby hot browns are not the only one of their kind, and the type of hot brown experience you eventually end up having depends a lot on what state you find yourself in. We even have Kentucky hot browns. Did you know that? Still though, one thing that is common to all of them is that they all take around 30 minutes to make and can feed a dozen people easily. God bless cooking in batches and easy prep. You might wonder where the hot brown originated, and while every state can claim its own take on the dish, only one can say they invented it: Louisville. Leftover turkey, an ambitious cheese sauce, and toasted bread would come together to create one heavy hitter of an open-faced sandwich. Definitely a favorite with kids, as you can imagine from the sound of it, but adults were known to get more than a little busy with it too. Let's not forget all the times a well-made bacon and onion sandwich made the difference between an exhausting, bland day and one with a warm and welcome surprise. Most people would be real cautious with their bacon, as the days of simply frying up a few strips and eating them as is were gone. You had to make each cut of meat count, especially bacon. While it was still attainable on average, its new prices were not doing anybody any favors. So people would dice up some onions, sauté them until they were that perfect golden brown, and make the bread themselves. Sometimes out of stuff like sawdust when dough would not be available, and there you had it. A perfectly vitalizing sandwich ready to put the spirit back into your tired body. Grandmas had this perfected down to a science, as they seemed to have developed a natural intuition for how much bacon, salt, and onions a good sandwich needed. Egg drop soup sounds a little fancier than it is, but have you never had a simple dish that knocked the socks off of you? Just a 2 or 3 ingredient show that really hit home, ticked every box, and left you with a smile? Egg drop soup was a lot like that. It was just diced potatoes and onions, which might get you thinking of the pie we just went over, but this is more like a broth. If chicken broth was there, then of course that was the foundation, but water worked too. Once the potatoes started cooking, you would drizzle some scrambled eggs before adding whole ones. It might look lumpy and score a little less for presentation, but it deserves a solid A+ just for the taste alone, especially if you would pair it with some leftover bread. Scrapple is pretty common in Pennsylvania even today, but it started in the 1930s as a mush of pork trimmings with cornmeal or buckwheat and some minimal spices. Since people had limited options for their culinary ventures, most scrapple were not as tasty as they could have been. That does not mean it lacked a kick, though, as most people found that even for trimmings, it worked pretty amazingly overall. People would regularly make it a habit to ask their butcher to save any scraps that were left over or unused because they had some scrapple in mind for today's menu. Especially in the Mid-Atlantic in places like Virginia, Delaware, Washington, and South Jersey. People would use offal too and make a broth out of the bones, though in the end any bones and fat were taken out of the dish. Bread pudding has been a subject of much discussion in the history books of our developments with food. It would be a bit of an undersell to call it polarizing, since some people claim it is the ultimate comfort food, and there simply is not anything like it. Others think it is an affront to the concept of bread and pudding simultaneously and fails to really capture the benefits of either. Still, the makeshift recipes from the 1930s were worth trying then and are still worth trying now, as they put bread pudding on the map and helped it stay there. It was a great way to repurpose leftover stale bread, and despite its record as the poor man's pudding, it was a common recipe in church cookbooks even before the recession hit. All you had to do was get some boiling water, sugar, spices, and bread, and sure, it was not the most appealing or appetizing lump of dough to eat, but it got you through the day, and in times of extreme scarcity, who could ask for more? Another meatless option, lima bean and peanut loaf, was a creative way to get your protein during the Depression. It's made by combining cooked lima beans, peanut butter, and breadcrumbs to form a loaf. The result was a savory loaf with a nutty flavor and a satisfying texture. It was an excellent meatless option for families looking to stretch their food budget. Plus, it was a great way to use up leftover beans and peanuts, ensuring nothing went to waste. Lima bean loaf allegedly tastes a bit like falafel, but is best with lots of highly seasoned gravy. This dish might sound a bit unusual, but it was a creative solution to a common problem: getting enough protein without emptying their pockets. Who would have thought that weeds could be a meal? Well, during the Great Depression, dandelion greens were a common sight on dinner tables. This vitamin-packed ingredient is foraged by Italian immigrant women in New York City. These bitter, leafy greens were rich in vitamins and minerals, making them a nutritious addition to any meal. People would often sauté the greens with a bit of bacon or lard, garlic, and onions to balance out the bitterness. They could also be used in salads or added to soups and stews. So, if you ever spot dandelions growing in your yard, remember that they're not just weeds. They're a delicious and nutritious green that can be enjoyed in a variety of ways. Just make sure they haven't been treated with any chemicals before you eat them. Oatmeal cakes are a warm, fuzzy childhood dish that many might associate with visits to their grandparents. Failing economy on one side and grandma spoiling her favorite niece and nephew on the other. You just know they will always find a way, and lucky enough for us that the people of the times did it so craftily. In 35 minutes, you had a wondrous dessert to yourself that was quick enough to make after long, panic-filled days. Canned oatmeal on a soft cake glazed with an almond or peanut topping really set hearts on fire. Despite the cake's popularity back then, especially in the fitness and health community, it still did not stand the test of the time. Of course, it is a great way to spice up your oatmeal, regardless of how other breakfasts prepared with more culinary liberties taken would eventually replace it. Squirrel stew is also called Brunswick stew, which might be a more familiar name since it is very well known in the South. Squirrel stew typically has much more positive associations than the ones it is tied to in the Great Depression era. In some areas that were struck exceptionally badly, it was hard to get any kind of meat. Stews had already been made with tomatoes, onions, and other basic vegetables that were available, but they were missing protein. Using squirrel in stews began to be widely incorporated into the daily meals of families following the onset of the Depression. The poor neighborhoods relied on variations of this stew that worked with what they had for regular nutrition. You have to consider that these were families used to eating meat before the brunt of the era hit America, and so squirrel meat was a welcome change. Shrub drinks were already really popular in America during the early 1920s, with one of the biggest hits being raspberry shrubs, and they were basically a good non-alcoholic drink to serve at bars or parties to minors, or just people who did not feel like getting their drink on. Aromatics, vinegar, concentrated fruits, and some sugar can work wonders in making you forget the joys of a whiskey on the rocks. Coincidentally, what was also very popular during the 20s were raspberries, specifically a strain of them known as Latham towards the end of the decade. Eventually, people literally put two and two together and came up with raspberry shrubs, and these almost overtook lemonades as America's most cherished drink. Open your minds and ears to one of the most confusing lineups of ingredients you will hear about: pineapple, lettuce, cherries, mayonnaise, yes, we were just as confused, and bananas. Now, what do all of these have to do with the other? Half of them sound like burger ingredients, and the other half look like toppings for a tropical drink or a fruit salad. Pineapple salad was exactly that, though, and it would highlight pineapples by serving the rest of the ingredients on a ring of them with cottage cheese. Fusion food is one thing, but this seems like an odd culinary Frankenstein. Maybe experimentation leads to happy accidents, since pineapple salads were certainly a lot more tolerable than pineapple pizzas. At least all of the 20s thought so. Since this is the last one on the list, let's make it a bit more interesting with a quick tourist tip. If you ever find yourself wandering the streets of New Orleans, be sure to try sweetbreads. Not sure what those are? You would not see them in mainstream American markets, but in the 20s they used to be on the shelves everywhere. These were usually served with candied pecans, pumpkin, or even some smoked farro. For the more intermediate or advanced chef that had a flair for the dramatic linguine or mushrooms, and brown butter would also work great. Still, none of that was the soul behind a great sweetbread as much as it did add to the experience. The real fun came from a process called acidulation, where the sweetbread is soaked in lemon juice or vinegar for a whole day. You can even use buttermilk, and this gives it a mild flavor that packs an explosive blow after the fact. People thought this was a fun dish, and the store-bought sweetbreads were an easy and delicious dinner, so we can definitely see why they were so loved. Stone soup is almost exactly what it sounds like, and it does involve a solid rock being in your soup. But hear us out, it is only temporary. Now, the origin of this term dates back to a European folktale about how two people would come into a town, convince everyone to share a bit of food, and then make a meal for the entire town. Sharing is caring, right? Anyway, the actual technique concerning food is to heat a rock in a fire and then place it in a bowl of soup so that it can cook it. People would add meat trimmings and scraps, plus carrots and cabbage to the soup to give it more nutritional value as well as flavor, and it did more or less work. What the real magic was that it browned the soup, which is something that you could not get in most standard soups people prepared. It also added a much richer flavor overall that was to die for, and people started to adopt the technique as it made soup on a budget much better than normal. Gelatin might seem like a strange ingredient for a savory dish, but it was commonly used during the Depression to stretch meat and add bulk to meals. Gelatin was a cheap, cutting-edge protein source in the 1930s, meaning it made its way into a lot of Depression-era cookbooks. Take corned beef luncheon salad, for example. It's a mix of canned corned beef, gelatin, canned peas, vinegar, and lemon juice. The dish was not a hit with culinary historian Jane Ziegelman, who described it as wrong in every way possible, just from the color to the smell, the texture, the flavor, and the way it feels in one's mouth. But it was all the rage back in the day. It might sound odd, but it was a popular way to use up leftovers. When sugar and milk were scarce, cornstarch pudding became a popular dessert. It's a simple mixture of cornstarch, sugar, and milk, cooked until thickened. This creamy pudding was made with just a few basic ingredients: milk, sugar, cornstarch, and a pinch of salt. It was a quick and easy dessert that could be flavored with vanilla, chocolate, or even fruit extracts, depending on what you had on hand. Cornstarch pudding was a favorite because it was cheap, easy to make, and could be customized to suit different tastes. It was a comforting treat that provided a little sweetness during tough times. So, if you're in the mood for a simple, nostalgic dessert, whip up a batch of cornstarch pudding. Who knows? It might just hit the right spot. Last, but certainly not least, we have poor man's stew, also known as Hoover stew, a dish named after President Herbert Hoover, who was often blamed for the hardships of the Great Depression. This simple stew was made with hot dogs, macaroni, canned tomatoes, and whatever vegetables were available. It was a hearty, one-pot meal that made the most of inexpensive ingredients. It was a filling and flavorful meal that could feed a family on a tight budget. It might not be fancy, but it did what it had to do back in the day. Apple Brown Betties were usually the grand desserts of the Great Depression. Before the Depression, this dessert was made with pie crusts that were usually packed with cinnamon and apples sprinkled with breadcrumbs on top using things like brown sugar. You can definitely imagine by now that the apple brown Bettys of the Depression were vastly different. When ingredients were rare, these even had oatmeal fillings and whatever else was in the cabinet. This was a very weird moment in history because these takes on the Brown Betty were not really popular, but not unknown either, existing in that weird middle gap between what you could expect to find out 610 households to a wildly different Betty in each block. Stereotypical variations of the desert, as well as ones from the years following the stock market crash, are now just memories and grandma's recipes. Hominy was made from dried maize kernels, and it was an often overlooked one until the Great Depression hit. People then began to realize that not only is hominy a very affordable grain found in cans everywhere, but it is also very healthy and tasty to eat. Stokely's hominy was a very popular and affordable brand that people might still have fond memories of. The taste can be best described as a cross between a dumplings and mashed potatoes. Hominy typically cost 15 cents or more at most U.S. stores, which in those times was definitely a steal. Hominy meant you had something for either a soup or a roast, or just a meal on its own. Guess the things that might really help you out in times like these might be right under your nose, or in this case, on grocery shelves you usually pass by. Wasn't this a wonderful, nostalgic journey through our Depression-era recipes? Give us a like, subscribe, and let's keep those memories alive.